very warm welcome to our students and dear listeners. Today we shall discuss the political philosophy of Aristotle, a maestro of political thought and philosophy. Much like Plato, his teacher, he was one of the stalwarts of his time, one of the intellectual stalwarts, if I may say. There was barely a field of knowledge, barely any subject into which Aristotle did not inquire or research or put his own contributions during his entire lifetime. Aristotle has often been referred to as the father of political science. And in the course of this discussion today, we shall try and justify this epithet which has been given to him. Aristotle was born in Stagira in 384 BC to a doctor father. His father, Nicomachus, was the court physician of a king of Macedon. Naturally, therefore, throughout his life we shall find in Aristotle a scientific bent of mind, a love for medicine and biology. Besides this, not much is known of Aristotle's childhood or his personality till he reaches the age of 17. At this age, he joined Plato's Academy, one of the most famous and perhaps the best known school at that point of time. Now, this association with Plato and with the Academy would continue for Aristotle for the next 20 years of his life. First, as a student at the Academy, and then as a member of the faculty. Now, after the death of Plato, Aristotle would end up leaving Academy. For the first time in 20 years, he would not have any further association with his educational institution. There are numerous rumors as to why Aristotle left the Academy, but that does not fall within the scope of our discussion here today. After leaving the Academy and Athens, Aristotle traveled to Asia Minor, where he met his wife. Having married, he settled down in Asia Minor for a very brief span of time. It was during his stay in Asia Minor that he got a proposal from the king of Macedon, from the then king of Macedon, King Philip, to coach his son, Alexander, as a private tutor. Now, Aristotle already had his childhood connections with Macedon. He moved to Macedon with his family and started coaching Alexander. Yes, the same Alexander who would become or try to become Alexander the Great in a few years' time. Now, while the coaching between Aristotle and Alexander continued for a mere 4 or 5 years, King Philip was suddenly assassinated. This assassination forced Alexander to give up his studies and ascend the throne. This educational relationship that Aristotle had with Macedonia came to an abrupt end. Now he was forced to give up the job and move back to Athens. At Athens, Aristotle saw that the Academy was not open to him in the same capacity that he would have liked it to be. Therefore, he ended up establishing his own school, which came to be known as the Lyceum. It was in Lyceum that Aristotle would spend the rest of his life studying, teaching, researching, writing, and writing more and more in perhaps all the subjects of human knowledge that existed at that particular point of time. Now, Alexander, after ascending the throne, had set upon himself the mission to become the conqueror of the entire world. In pursuance of this ambitious project, Alexander started attacking, along with his Macedonian armies, he started attacking the city-states of Greece. Aristotle found himself in a very curious position. He was known to have spent his childhood in Macedon. His father and he himself had had contacts with the Macedonian royalty. He had personally coached Alexander. He had come back to Athens. He had opened a school over here. And now Athens was one of the cities which was being attacked by Alexander along with his armies. This fall or faltering in the relationship between Aristotle and Alexander continued till the end of his days. The Greek city-states were getting restless under Macedonia's imperialist attacks. And had fate not intervened, perhaps Alexander would have been able to accomplish his dream of establishing a world empire. It was fate which intervened, and Alexander suddenly died, and that forced the Macedonians to give up their extremely ambitious project of conquering the entire world. The city-states, which were highly irritated and agitated by Alexander and by the Macedonian imperialist tendencies, which reverted or revolted, and Athens was one of the first city-states to declare a war upon Macedon. At this point of time, Aristotle found himself to be in a very curious position. He left Athens once again. After leaving Athens, he spent the last remaining year of his life in a place called Chalcis, where he is said to have died of untreatable indigestion at the age of 62. But by the time he had reached the age of 62, he had achieved what many men would perhaps not have even dreamed of achieving in 600 years. Aristotle is known as the father of political science, but it is not just political science or political philosophy in which he has left his mark. He had interests in subjects like ethics, aesthetics, biology, medicine, physics, psychology, law, language, poetry, justice, philosophy, you name it, and Aristotle had researched into that particular genre of thought or perusal. Aristotle's immense contribution to political philosophy also lies in the fact that he was the first one, perhaps, to have used the comparative method of analysis. A comparative method is one which believes in comparing two categories which are similar to each other in order to find out the relative merits and demerits of the particular system. Aristotle was one of the first to use this comparative method of analysis, and comparative politics, as you know today, is not just important, it is perhaps one of the most upcoming branches or approaches to the study of political science. The second very important contribution that Aristotle made in his study or in his approach to studying politics was his use of the inductive method of analysis. An inductive method of analysis is where particular knowledges are gained from particular samples put together under severe and continuous observation, and only then are general principles of knowledge derived. This made Aristotle's approach or style of analysis much more realistic, much more practical, much more dependable. Based on his inductive and comparative method, Aristotle's corpus of work became huge. There was barely a field of study in which he did not research or in which he did not write copious volumes that any student studying any of those languages or subjects would not have to study at all. As far as Aristotle's political works are concerned, the most important work would be Politics, next Nicomachean Ethics, and Eudaimonian Ethics. In Book 2 of Politics, Aristotle would deal with the ideal state, the historical study of earlier theories regarding the composition, the nature, the functions of the state, and also certain parts of Book 2 would also comprise of criticisms of Plato. Book 3 of the Politics would deal with nature of state and citizenship. Books 7 and 8 would deal with the construction of the ideal state. Books 4, 5, and 6 would belong to the period which Aristotle had spent in the Lyceum, studying, researching, and comparatively analyzing around 158 constitutions of the world, and that would deal with a study of the actual constitutions of the states, the contemporary states that existed around the Greek city-states at that point of time. He would also make a detailed study of oligarchic and democratic forms of government and reach his ideal form of government by combining the elements of both these forms of government. Um, as far as politics is concerned, it gives us a peek into Aristotle's conception of an ideal state. But before moving into his idea of the ideal state, we have to understand why was Aristotle looking for an ideal state. Firstly, we should keep in mind that the Greek city-states had already undergone the trauma of the Peloponnesian War. Whatever the Hellenic world had valued as their achievements, their political institutions, their democratic institutions, the rights and liberties that citizens of these city-states enjoyed, the stability of their political structures, everything had been faced with a major crisis with the Peloponnesian War. And soon after dealing with this first crisis, the next blow came from the Macedonian imperialistic attacks. While King Alexander had set out on a mission to conquer the world, first and foremost he had started attacking the Greek city-states. So one blow after another had actually shaken the roots, the foundations of the city-states on which the Greeks had founded their lives, their accomplishments, and their self-images. Naturally then, Aristotle, while he was inquiring into so many subjects, was bound to think about the ideal state. According to Aristotle, the state was a natural institution. Every organism, according to him, had what he called a telos. Telos, according to Aristotle, was the goal. Each and every organism, right from the simplest to the most complex organism, was believed by Aristotle to possess this ultimate goal, that is, a motion or a journey of becoming. Each and every organism, whether it was a simple organism or a very complex organism, a system, a group, everything seemed to exist for a reason. The journey of life, whether it was that of an individual or of a system or of the entire state, seemed, according to Aristotle, to have an ultimate motive or an ultimate goal. This goal is what Aristotle refers to as the telos. Now, according to Aristotle, man, being a part of nature, possessed reason. It was this reason which enabled man to seek good life. In order to lead a good life, man needed conditions which could be created only by the state. That is what, according to Aristotle, makes the state a natural institution. It was the state which was the outer or concrete manifestation of man leading a meaningful social political life. Without a state, according to Aristotle, man could live in a group, man could live an animal existence, but not acquire all the potentials or achieve all the potentials that he was actually gifted with by nature. He considered the family to be the most important and the most basic of society, the most basic unit of society, because the family comprised of three primary relationships. The relationship between a man and his wife, the relationship between a man and his child, and the relationship between man and his slave, or rather, master and his slave. These were the three basic relationships upon which Aristotle premised the family. These three relationships helped man to fulfill all his physical, emotional, material, sexual needs. Once fulfilled thus within the family, many families, according to Aristotle, combined together to form what is known as the hellas or the villages. And many villages or households grouped together, according to Aristotle, formed what came to be known as the state or the polis. It was only within the precinct of the state that such conditions existed where every man could become or achieve his best self. Because a basic difference was identified by Aristotle between man and any other animal. An animal could live only to eat, sleep, reproduce or procreate, and then finally die. But man had certain higher telos destined for him. In order to achieve those higher ends, it was essential for man to get such conditions around him which would bring out the best within him. And that is what perhaps forced Aristotle to say that it was only a beast or a god who could live without the state. The state alone, therefore, being a natural institution, an extension of man, an extension of his family, an extension of all the villages, that the state could alone create those conditions which would bring out the best that was there in man. And this state, according to Aristotle, would have to be governed by a sovereign. Now, what exactly did Aristotle understand by a sovereign? He referred to a group of people and not a single person. Because unlike his master, unlike his teacher Plato, he did not put his entire faith on knowledge or wisdom being the sole qualification for a good ruler. He believed that it was only a person who was ruled who could become a good ruler. Thus, for him, nobody, neither an individual nor a group, could stay in power forever. Firstly. Secondly, the consent of the ruled was an absolute necessity for the ruler. In order to become a ruler, you would have to have the consent of the majority people over whom you would rule. Only good subjects could make good rulers as far as Aristotle was concerned. Moreover, participation in the politics or the political activities of the polis was another essential criteria that Aristotle set forward. He had no use for such people who were too rich, too busy, or too poor and therefore unable to think about politics, to participate in politics, or to bother about politics. Such people would neither enjoy citizenship in his scheme of things, nor could they ever become rulers. It was only the middle class, according to Aristotle, who possessed adequate amount of leisure, of property, of slaves, of mental activity, which would enable them to think, participate, and then rule the entire polis. Not just for the sake of improvement of self, because they would not be in power for very long. Aristotle devised a special form of government where the rulers would rule by rotation, never staying in power for long enough to get corrupted. That was Aristotle's antidote to corruption while staying in political power or while enjoying political power. The consent of the governed was perhaps for the first time emphasized in political thought. Because thus far, as we've seen Aristotle's master Plato, what was emphasized upon was the quality of the ruler. And as far as the quality of the ruler was concerned, the most important quality was thought to be nothing but wisdom. There was no question of a Platonic philosopher king ever being accountable to the people over whom he ruled. For Plato, it was a given that a man as wise as a philosopher king or a woman as wise as a philosopher queen would do only what was best for their subjects. Aristotle has no such faith in either wisdom as a quality or in any singular individuals. He knows that a state comprises of different categories of people having different concerns and different interests. To put a single individual or a group of individuals from a single class as a ruler would mean that majority of the other interests and demands in society would never get fulfilled. Therefore, he sort of fuses certain elements of oligarchy and certain elements of democracy to form his ideal government, where the rulers would come to power on the basis of consent of the subjects, firstly. Secondly, they would stay in power only for a very limited period of time. Thirdly, they would be answerable to their subjects for every action that they undertook on behalf of their subjects. Such was Aristotle's conception of the ideal state and the ideal government that he had devised or envisioned. Next, we shall come to Aristotle's classification of states. I want to make a point over here that actually he does not classify states. It is not possible to classify states. States, as we know, will have 4 basic characteristics, and these will not generally vary from place to place or state to state. What Aristotle had actually classified was the different types of governments that existed during his period, during his times. It was his students who visited different parts of the world and collected the constitutions available of those countries wherever they went, wherever they traveled, and brought back copies of these constitutions to Aristotle. And using the method that he had devised, the comparative method of analysis, Aristotle studied these 157 or 58 approximately constitutions to classify the governments that existed around that period of time. Now, while classifying these different governments, he uses two bases or two criterias. One is the qualitative basis, the other is the quantitative basis. What do I mean by quantitative basis? Quantitative basis refers to the number of people who are ruling a particular state at a given point of time. What then is a qualitative basis? Quality refers to the end or the goal with which a ruler is ruling. For instance, if a ruler rules for the benefit of his subjects, then his rule is said to be a moral rule. Whereas, if a single individual or a group of individuals are ruling for selfish interests, if they are corrupt or they are abusing power, then that particular form of government would be known as a perverted form of government. On these two bases then, quantitative as well as qualitative, we first come to rule by a single individual. When a single individual ruled for the interests of the people or his subjects, that is, he was a good ruler, a morally upright ruler, then that form of government or state Aristotle would call a monarchy. Mono, as we know, refers to one, and archy comes from arcus, which refers to rule. So rule of one person for the sake of good of the people, Aristotle called monarchy. Whereas, if a single individual ruled for selfish interests, motivated by private ends, egotistical, property-related, wealth-related, for individual fame, for individual glory, then that particular rule would be known as a tyranny, a tyrannical rule. The second category of states that Aristotle talks about is when a small group of people rule over a state. Very few people, but a group rule over a state. This group, when it ruled for the good of the people, of a general welfare, public welfare, then he called this particular type of state an aristocracy. Aristocrats, as we know, are the elites of a society, the rich people, the knowledgeable people, the cream of a society basically. On the other hand, when a few people or a small group of people ruled over a state, but out of spite, out of corruption, out of internal jealousies, competitions, or any other negative motivation, when they ruled for their own interests, this particular form of government was called by Aristotle as an oligarchy. The third category of states that Aristotle talks about is where many people are ruling over a state at the same point of time. Now, obviously, to us, residents of the modern world, this type of a government would be known as a democracy. Here, Aristotle differs from us. He says that when many people rule for the benefit of all, that particular rule should be referred to as polity. Whereas, when a mass rule degenerated into a mob rule where anybody and everybody was king and nobody ready to be a subject, that type of a government would be referred to as a democracy. These are then the classifications of government as put forward by Aristotle, and he also talks about what is known as the cycle of change. Very quickly, summarizing the cycle of change, we can say that when a single person's rule degenerated, rather like it was more like a king, a good king whose successor was not exactly very good, or might have been mean, might have not been capable as a king. When he took up ruling his people on the basis of heredity, he turned into a tyrant. In order to depose of the tyrant, a small group of aristocrats or nobles might have revolted or rebelled against the tyrant, killed him, and then started ruling over that particular state. This would lead to what Aristotle called aristocracy. Now, aristocracy over a period of time might get degenerated because the first generation of aristocrats would have been more dedicated towards their subjects, but with the passage of time, their inheritors or their successors might not have the same sort of commitment for their people. Okay, there might have been internal rivalries, corruption, etc., which would lead to aristocracy becoming oligarchy. Now, when people would become fed up with both tyranny as well as oligarchy, people would be forced to resort to self-rule. That is when a polity would be formed. There would be a mass level revolution, perhaps, a mass level rebellion, wherein people would want to rule over themselves. This would establish polity. But then, with the passage of time again, there was bound to be a degeneration in the quality of rulers because there was bound to be lack of knowledge, there was bound to be lack of expertise, and generally a lackadaisical attitude towards taking responsibility for rule. That would lead to the formation of democracy. In order to counter the evil effects of democracy and avoid chaos at the mass level, once again, a very strong ruler, a single ruler, would have to come and take the reins of power in his own hand, and thus we would go back to monarchy, completing the cycle. In the next episode, we shall discuss certain very pertinent issues taken up by Aristotle, like his notions about family, slavery, women, property, as well as justice, and we shall also discuss the all-important Aristotelian conception of the golden mean. Thank you.